Who is your hero? The answer to that question might depend on who that question is asked to. If you were to ask some of the adults in the audience, who is your hero, you might get answers like, my parents, my mom or my dad. Someone might say, my spouse. Others may mention maybe a mentor that they had along the way that helped them to get to where they are today. If you were to ask a teenager, who is it that is your hero? Well, you might get a parent, but you might also get maybe some celebrity. You might get an actor or a musician or an athlete, or maybe something we never really considered 15 or 20 years ago. You might get an influencer. And if you don't know what an influencer is, ask somebody much younger than you and they can explain what an influencer is. If you were to ask children, of course you might get mama or daddy, but you might also get some cartoon character, right? You might get Bluey, or you might get Mickey Mouse, or I know when one of my boys was really little, he was a big fan of Jake the Pirate. And so, that was kind of for a while, that was his hero. He wanted to be like Jake the Pirate. Who is your hero? As I think about that question, I think really the answer to that question will depend on maybe how we define the word hero. And in an audience this size with this many different people from many different backgrounds, the way you define hero might be a little bit different than the way that someone else defines the word hero. We were talking about a teenager and a young person, what you would, if you ask them who their hero is, maybe some of the answers that you might get. And you think, okay, well, like take an influencer, for instance, and you think, okay, well, that's more modern day, right? I mean, I guess maybe that's to be expected in 2024, but what if you go back? What if you go back, 10, 20 years, maybe even 30 or 40 years, you ask that question to a group of 8th graders. Now, I know there are some of you in here, you're teachers, and maybe you teach middle school, so anytime you ask an 8th grader something, you never know what the answer might be. And so this question was posed many, many years ago to a group of 8th graders, and they were asked the question, who is someone that you look up to, someone that you consider to be your hero? 2,000 different 8th graders were asked that question, and every answer that was given was a celebrity or an entertainer. That study was from 40 years ago. And that caused a columnist by the name of Sidney Harris to kind of lament over this. And he had this quote. I want you to notice this quote with me. He said, talking about these 2,000 8th graders, and why is it that they didn't mention parents? Why is it they didn't mention their, astronauts? He mentions, painters and writers, authors. And this is what he said. He said, the heroes and heroines created by our society are people who have made it big, but not necessarily people who have done big things. Right? Really, basically, the definition of what a hero is, right? There's people who have done big, or made it big, but they haven't really done anything big to get there, right? Maybe they're famous, but really, what is it that they have done? And so this morning, I want us to begin a series that I'm calling Unlikely Heroes. And it's going to be stories based on some people in Scripture that maybe you're familiar with their names. Maybe you're even familiar with some of their story. But perhaps you're not as familiar with the reason that maybe we would consider them to be a hero. And as we begin this series, I want to give you kind of a big idea for this entire series. And the big idea is this: you do not have to be known in order to make a difference. You don't have to be known. You don't have to be big in order to make a difference. And that's really what this series is going to be centered on. And as we begin this series this morning, I want to go back several thousand years into history, and really to a time when Israel, before they go into the Promised Land, where they find themselves in Egypt. You may remember they spent some time before they ended up in the land of their inheritance in Egypt. And in Exodus chapter 1, we're going to begin looking at verse 8 to get a little context here. It says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." Now this statement, is a statement that we've probably read before, but it's a statement that's important. Because this new king who arises in Egypt, it says, who does not know Joseph. Now, many of you here are probably familiar with the story of Joseph. You're probably familiar with some of his dealings and workings. You know how he was sold by his brothers into slavery due to their jealousy, and he eventually ends up in Egypt, and he's working in the house of Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife makes a pass at him. He refuses, runs out, yet he's thrown in jail for a sin, for a crime he didn't commit. He spends a few years in prison. Eventually, he gets out of prison because he interprets Pharaoh's dream, and Pharaoh puts him in charge. Basically, he rises up the ranks and becomes what we would call the second most important person in all of Egypt. And he helps Egypt during a time of good and also a time of famine, to where Egypt has food while all the surrounding nations don't have any, and they're having to come to Egypt to buy food. And eventually, because of his success with Pharaoh and because of his success with Egypt, we find that his family leaves Canaan. They are moved to Egypt, where they are going to dwell and be able to be with Joseph. And so for a period of years, things are really well. Joseph is an important person. Israel has a special place in Egypt. But the day comes when there comes a king who, he doesn't know Joseph. We would say it this way, he doesn't know history. And sometimes that's what happens, right? The further you're removed from something, the further or the harder it is to maybe remember what it was once like. I think about today, for some of you especially, you grew up in a time when you didn't have to worry about what came upon the TV screen, whether it was a television show, whether it was even a commercial. You never had to worry about what was said or what was going to be advertised. But it's hard to remember those days, because now we have to watch and be intently watch to see what's coming across the screen. Some of us are old enough to remember when Sundays were sacred days. They were considered a day of worship, a day of rest, and a lot of businesses were closed. But for some, you don't even know what that's like, because it seems so long ago. It's almost forgotten that it used to be that way. So here you have this king, and the story of Joseph, it's kind of ancient history, and he doesn't know Joseph. And so look what it says he does in verse 9. It says, so he says to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape the land. Now, I want you to notice, because he doesn't know the history of Israel, and all of a sudden he's got all these kind of foreigners in his land, and he begins to notice, there's a lot of these people. And they're growing pretty rapidly. And so we need to do something. And so he's in what we might call this catch-22 here, because in one sense, he's scared of the people. He's afraid. He fears Israel because they're mighty. They're too many, and they're going to grow to be mighty. And you know what? They might even join with our enemy. And if they join with our enemy, then they may turn against us. And that wouldn't be good for us, because there's a whole lot of them. But then there's the flip side of the coin too. I mean, he's scared to have them in the land, but he's also scared for them to leave the land. I don't want them to leave the land. What happens if they escape? And so here he is, and he's got to decide, okay, what are we going to do? So look at verse 11. Verse 11 says, therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. Look down at verse 13. Verse 13 says, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves. They made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. And in all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Due to the fear of Pharaoh and the people of Israel, there's a lot of them. And they may grow to be really strong. They may grow to turn against us. We've got to do something. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to work them to death. We're going to make life miserable for them. We're going to treat them as slaves. And we're going to work them to the point that, they can't do anything else. I think that's kind of his plan here. We work them so hard. We treat them like slaves. We're mean to them. And you know what? All they do is they work and they sleep. They won't have time to do anything else. And I kind of understand that, don't you? Because you know what it's like after a hard day's work, right? You work all day and you go home at night. How do you feel? tired, right? I mean, how many of us have at some point, maybe we had this plan, hey, after work today, here's what we're going to do. And I got this great plan. You know, I'm going to work around the house or my family. We're going to go do something. But then you go to work and you spend all day working and you get home. And by the time you get home, guess what you don't want to do? I don't want to do whatever we plan to do. What do I want to do? I want to sit down in my recliner and do nothing, right? We get that, right? We're tired. And so here you have Pharaoh. Well, let's work these people to death. Let's treat these people like slaves. And you know what? They won't have time for anything else. They'll be too tired for anything. But notice verse 12. But the more they oppressed, and the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. See, Pharaoh's grand plan is, hey, let's treat them like slaves. Let's work them really hard. And when we do that, they'll stop growing. They'll stop reproducing. But here's what Pharaoh didn't know. He didn't know that his plan was trying to work against the plan of God. His plan was trying to work against the promise of God. You remember what God promised Abraham way back in Genesis chapter 12? He said, through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. In your seed, right? All the families of the earth are going to be blessed. You're going to have this great nation of people. And here Pharaoh is, and he's trying to defeat the plans of God. He thinks that he can cause the people of Israel not to grow and not to multiply. But you can never, listen, you can never defeat the plans and promises of God. Titus chapter 1 verse 2 tells us God cannot lie. If God makes a promise, we can take it to the bank, so to speak. And he's trying to defeat the people, but it's not working. No matter how hard he oppresses them, they're multiplying. So you get to verse 15, our scripture reading this morning. And it says, so then the king said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, the other Puah, when you serve as midwives to the Hebrew women and you see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. See, Pharaoh realizing, hey, his plan to treat them like slaves and work them like dogs, it wasn't doing anything. They were still reproducing. They were still multiplying, right? In fact, the nation of Egypt, the people of Egypt, they're afraid. They're growing in fear. So he says, here's what we're going to do. And he turns to these two, what we read are midwives, right? Midwives, just were these ladies who helped with the birth of children. And these two particularly are mentioned by name, probably not the only two midwives in Egypt, right? Obviously, these are probably what we might call chief midwives. They're over a bunch of other midwives. And so he turns to them, one named Shiphrah, whose name means beauty, and the other named Puah, whose name means splendor. And he says, here's what you're going to do. When the Hebrew women have a baby, if it's a girl, she can live. But if it's a boy, I want you to kill it. Do you see how low Pharaoh has sunk? He has sunk to the point that he is willing to basically commit full birth abortion. He's willing to commit genocide. He wants to take out all the baby boys, and really, that was actually kind of common back in those days. And it wouldn't really be that hard for the midwives to do, because after the mother gives birth, as they take the baby away to kind of clean it up, whoops, your baby died. They could have easily gotten away with it. But notice the response of the midwives. The end of when you get to verse number 17. Verse 17 says, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the male children live. The king gives the command and says, here's what I want you to do. When they have a son, I want you to kill him. Now that's not just, a suggestion. This is an order given from the king. And when the king gives an order, what's the king expect? He expects the order to be done, right? He expects you to do what it is that he's ordering and commanding you to do. But these midwives, notice their response. They let the children live. See, we might say these midwives, they chose to do the honorable, even when it was hard. They chose to do what was honorable, even though it was hard. The honorable thing was to let the children live. That was the honorable thing to do. But the hard thing to do was to go against the king. Was to go against an order that had been given by Pharaoh himself. And I think about that, and I think about how difficult that command might have been. And I think about how honorable these women were, and then it makes me think about my own life. And it makes me have to stop and ask myself the question, listen, when I find myself in a hard circumstance, a hard situation, am I willing to do what is honorable? When I find myself in a situation that is hard, that is difficult, will I choose to give in, or will I choose to do the honorable thing? And listen, the honorable thing is to always do what God wants me to do, right? Being obedient to the will of God is the honorable thing. And these women were given this choice. They had to decide what to do. But what about you and me? What about when, we find ourselves around other people? And other people want us to compromise our values and our morals and our principles. Are we willing to do the honorable, even though we find ourselves in a hard situation? Young people, when your friends want you to do something that you know you shouldn't do, that's a hard place to find yourself in. Will you do the honorable thing? When your spouse asks you to maybe do something that you shouldn't do. Maybe your spouse is wanting you to be involved in something that you shouldn't be involved in. Maybe your spouse is wanting you to, maybe stay away from the church for a while. Skip church, so to speak. That's a hard situation to find yourself in. When you find yourself in that situation, will you do the honorable? What about when your boss comes to you and your boss asks you to do something that really is like lying or cheating or stealing? That's a hard place to be in. But when you find yourself in that hard place, will you be willing to do the honorable? I want you to fill in this blank. I want you to think about. Hold on. Before I give you that, let me think about the midwives for a second. Go back to verse 17, and I want you to notice specifically what it says about the midwives. Obviously, the midwives let these children live, right? They let the babies live. But notice the beginning of verse 17. What's the beginning of verse 17 say? These midwives did what? They feared God. Not only did they choose to do the honorable thing when it came to obeying the will of God, even though it was hard, but secondly, these women, they feared God more than they feared man. You think about Pharaoh for just a moment. Like Pharaoh, the whole reason we're in this situation is because Pharaoh fears the people. And he gives this command to these women, and I think about these women, and I think, you know what? There's probably some fear of Pharaoh. I mean, after all, this is the one who can take your life. This is the one who can make life pretty difficult for you, right? That's what he could do. But even though they may have feared Pharaoh, they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. Think about the words of Jesus in Matthew, the 10th chapter, where Jesus said there, do not fear him who can kill the body, but instead fear the one who can destroy both body and soul in hell. Right? I mean, the midwives, what could Pharaoh do? Okay, Pharaoh can take my life, but Pharaoh can't touch my soul. The people of the world, the situations around me, listen, they can affect my life. They can persecute me. They can end my life. It happens to Christians all across the world. But they can't touch that person's soul. When it comes to our own lives and we look at the example of the midwives, we see these individuals who feared God more than they feared man. So that begs the question for us. Do I fear God more than I fear man? Or do I fear man more than I fear God. Now, I think all of us in here this morning, we would say, well, I fear God, right? I mean, that's the right answer, right? I fear God more than I fear man. It's easy to say that, but it's something else to live that. It's a lot harder to live that idea out. In fact, we go back to maybe some of the examples that we gave just a moment ago, and you think about, okay, I fear, or you ask the question, okay, when I find myself going against the world, right? The world wants me to compromise my morals, my values, my principles, well, what do? We talk about doing the honorable thing in the midst of the hard thing, but really, if I'm going to do the honorable thing in the midst of the hard situation, I have to be willing to fear God more than I fear man. So the question becomes, who do I fear more, God or the world around me? When my friends ask me to participate in something, to do something that I know is not right, do I fear God more than I fear man? When my spouse asks me or my boss asks me to do something that I know I shouldn't do, that's wrong, who do I fear more? Do I fear God more, or do I fear man more? I think about what Paul said in Galatians chapter 1, verse number 10, where he says, if we please men, if we aim to please man, we are not a servant of Christ. See, if your aim is to please man, then you're not a servant of Christ. Why? Because you fear man more than you fear God. And the midwives, why do they make the decision to do the honorable in the midst of the hard? Because you know what? They feared God more than they feared man. Now, let's think about us and let's fill in this blank. I fear God and will not what? In other words, because I fear God, I will not. What needs to be put in that blank for you? See, the truth of the matter is all of us can fill in that blank with something, and it would be different, perhaps different from a lot of other people here. For a lot of us, there's multiple things that we could put in that blank. What is it that we say, I fear God, and because I fear God, I will not. For the ladies, it was, I will not kill these babies. But what is it for me? Because I fear God, I will not give in to my coworkers. I will not give in to the people of the world wanting to compromise my beliefs and my morals and my values. Because I fear God, I will not. Only you can answer that question. The midwives did the honorable in the midst of the hard because they feared God more than they feared man. But I think there's a second reason that the ladies did the honorable in the midst of the hard. It wasn't just that they feared God more than they feared the Pharaoh or the man, but number two, it's because they valued life more than they valued luxury. They valued life more than they valued... if they would have obeyed the command of the king, if they would have done what Pharaoh wanted them to do, their life could have been quite nice. I mean, if you really succeed and you're doing a good job and you please the person who has asked you to do something, typically good things happen to you, right? And for these women, good things could have happened. But they didn't care about the luxury of life. They didn't value that. What did they value? They valued life itself. And I think about the world that I find myself in today, the world that you find yourself in today. And I think the value of life, the sanctity of life, it's under attack. And we can look at the, maybe the situation that happened with the Supreme Court back in June of 2022. And yes, we applaud that. We're excited about that. But that doesn't change the fact that the sanctity of life is still under attack today. And it's under attack, friends, from the womb all the way to the tomb. From the baby inside mama's belly all the way to the older person. From the womb to the tomb. And I think about how the opening chapter of the Bible speaks of God, this creator, and he goes through and he creates the world and in 6 days, and everything he creates is good, but you get to day 6 and he creates man. And of all the things God created, the greatest creation of all was man. You want to know why? Because according to Genesis chapter 1 verse 27, God created man in his own image. We're uniquely created. We're created after the image of our Creator. And that goes not just for me. That doesn't just go for my family. That goes for you and your family. And it doesn't matter your race. It doesn't matter your nationality. It doesn't matter your ethnicity. It doesn't matter where you live in this world. Each and every person born, conceived, is a person, is an individual who's made in the image of God. Thus, their life has value. Job 31 and verse 15, Job says there, talking in response to his friends, and he says, "Did not he who made me in the womb also make him? Were we not fashioned in the womb?" God would tell Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 4 and 5, "Hey, before you were born, I knew you. I formed you in the womb." You think about the value of life, friends, and you think about how important it is. And listen, it's not just important when it comes to the unborn children of the world. Okay? It's just as important when the children come after they're born. Right? When children make their entrance into the world, so to speak. It's just as important then as it is when they're still in the womb. And that right continues not only when they're babies, when they're children, but even when they're adults. So that's what we have to remember. Valuing life isn't just about the unborn. Now that's important, don't get me wrong. But it's about all life. And it's about all life of all ages. So let's think about this and fill in this blank. Because I value life, I will what? Because I value life, I will stand for the unborn? Yeah, we should. Because I value life, I will stand for the unborn, and I will do that by the way that I choose to vote, maybe. By the things that I choose to support. But what about this? Because I value life, I will stand for justice. Or maybe we say, I'll stand against injustice. When we see injustice in the world, that should anger us, a righteous anger. And I should want to respond. I should want to do something about the injustices of the world. Oh, it's not happening to me. Just because it's not happening to me doesn't make it right. Or what about those individuals maybe who are born, but who maybe we might call are social outcasts, or maybe they have some kind of physical deformity, or maybe some kind of handicap. Because I value life, I'll befriend those people. Because I value life, I'll stand for those people. Because I value life, I'll fight for those people. See, that's what it means to value life. I think about these Hebrew midwives, and I think about their response when the king gives this order, hey, you kill all these Hebrew baby boys. They chose to do the honorable even though it was hard. Why? Well, number one, they feared God. But number two, they valued life. And so you get to verse 18 and you see the response of the king. The king looks at the women and he calls the midwives in and says, "What have you done? Why have you let the male children live?" And the midwives say to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women were not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous and they give birth before the midwives come to them." Now you read that and you think, well, whoa, they did the honorable thing here, huh? Right? And a lot of times we want to look at this and we say, well, they lied. And perhaps they did. Perhaps they were lying. But if they did, that's not what's being commended here. The lie is not being commended. What's being commended is the fear of God. We think about Rahab in Joshua chapter 2, right? But I would beg to say they could be telling the truth. They could have been telling the truth. The Hebrew women could have been giving birth more quickly than the midwives could get there. Now, they may have told the midwives, hey, be slow getting there, right? To give time, so they can have the birth so we can say this. That could have very well happened. The truth of the matter is did they lie or didn't they lie? But that's not the point. Because what I see is what I read in verse number 20. God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew strong. See, the midwives, they were blessed by God because of their bravery. Because of the decision that they made to choose to do the honorable, even though it was hard, to choose to be brave, God blessed them. In fact, verse 21 tells us that God gave the midwives families. The tradition says that these women didn't have children of their own, and so God blessed them with children. The very individuals they were trying to protect is the very thing that God gave them. And I think about that, and I think about their bravery, and I think about, here are these two women that, yeah, we know their names, and yeah, we know their story. But whether we realize it or not, these women, they were heroes. They were heroes because they chose to do the honorable thing, even though it was hard. And when I think about us today, and when people look at us, could the same thing be said about us? When people look at my life, do they see a person who chooses to honor God even though it's hard? Do they see a person who values or who fears God more than he fears man? Do they see an individual that values life more than he values luxury? You ask different people, what makes a hero? And you'll get many different answers. But a true hero is a person who's willing to do the honorable thing, even when it's difficult. It's a person who's willing to be obedient to God, even when those around them may order them not to. It's a person who says, you know what, I stand with Jesus over everything else. Maybe you're here this morning and maybe you're not a Christian, and maybe for you today, the thing that you need to do, the choice that you need to make is to give your life to Christ, to submit to His will, to be buried in the waters of baptism for the forgiveness of your sins. Maybe it's a hard thing for you because of your family situation, but it's also an honorable thing to do because it's obedience to the will of God. If you're here today and you're not a Christian, we want you to take that opportunity today to become a child of God. But maybe you are here today, and maybe you are a Christian. Many of you are, and you were buried in the waters of baptism. But maybe as you think about your walk with God, you realize, you know what? I haven't been living the way that I need to live. I'm not being the kind of person that I need to be. I'm not a person who's willing to do the honorable when it's hard. I always choose the easy way out. I'm not a person who fears God more than I fear man. I allow the people around me to dictate what I do and the decisions I make. Or maybe I'm a person who values luxury more than I really value life. And I need forgiveness for that. If you're here today and you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we're going to have a shepherd down front. We want to pray with you. We want to pray for you today. Pray that you'll respond to the invitation now as together we stand and as we sing.